So I've been thinking all my life really about politics. It's something that I think everyone really needs to be involved in and think about and discuss and debate and learn about, right? It's your duty to do that because when politics goes wrong, it affects absolutely everybody. Um, Everybody is governed by politicians, whether you like it or not. And yeah, I think it's a moral duty to educate yourself in these areas. Now, in my attempts to educate myself in these areas, I have read several books on economics from different viewpoints. I have looked into the history, although I'm no scholar of history, I have to say, but I've looked into the history of various countries, and in particular, I was interested in the history of Iraq and how Saddam Hussein came to power. And so I read this when I was a teenager. Do you notice the family resemblance? Well, it's not even something to joke about, but realistically, yeah, my family's from Iraq, and this guy here, Saddam Hussein, was a bit of a nut. Yeah, actually, editing the video, I saw this and I thought it reminded me of a few things I thought worth mentioning. So one of my cousins came to this country when she was 13. She'd with her family, right? But obviously, I didn't, talk to her dad that much. But not because I was about the same age as her, about 14, 15 years old, I think. And one of the things that she had, the watch she was wearing, was just like this. And the reason why she wore it, despite the fact that her own father, and he told me what happened to him, he was tortured basically by Saddam's people. And obviously she had a very good reason to hate the guy. But she wore this watch because if you're living in Iraq and people had the slightest suspicion that you didn't like Saddam Hussein, that would be enough to have you arrested and tortured. So everybody had to have a poster or a picture on their mantelpiece in their house, and it was essentially, it was like a piece of, everybody had to have a picture of Saddam with them, they had to show that they loved him, all the rest of it. So I think that that kind of thing is really hard to imagine. Imagine being forced to have a photograph of Theresa May in your living room, and if you didn't have it, you could be arrested. These kind of realities are hard to get your head around if you've never come across them, and I think that when I was growing up and tried to talk to people about politics, these types of ideas, people forget that these things happen really quickly. So it's worth reminding ourselves that this guy, he was a National Socialist. That's what his party was, the National Socialist Baath Party, and yeah, the ideas that allowed him to get into power, and he tried to push upon his populace, were dangerous, basically, and produced these results. Dictatorships, and basically, when politics goes wrong, is something that's affected my family quite deeply. So it's always been an interest of mine. So the way my mind works, the way I think, is quite scientific, I suppose, and quite abstract. I like to think about the big picture. And I do that thing that physicists do a lot, although I'm not a physicist really. I'm trained as an engineer, but I've spent a hell of a lot of time studying physics. So I like to look at it from sort of first principles.
A good framework for thinking is physics, the sort of first principles reasoning. I mean, generally, I think there are, what I mean by that is boil things down to their fundamental truths and reason up from there.
So I always imagine to myself, how would this play out? How would this political idea play out if you had 100 people on an island? I mean, you've got to imagine that human beings did not enter the universe, enter the world with governments fully formed, right? If you went back in time, say 10,000 years, 200,000 years, huge amounts of time, how did people organize themselves and how did they think about things? So you never get a blank slate. You're always starting from somewhere. But if we could imagine a blank slate, what would it look like? Well, I like to imagine what would happen if you had 100 people on an island and they had to decide how they would get on. Okay, so let's take an example and try it out. Now, as I'm sure you can appreciate, given the circumstances of my family and having had quite a few of them flee Iraq, human rights are interesting, right? But let's see what happens when we try out human rights on our island of 100 people. Okay. So there are 30 human rights and freedoms set out by the United Nations in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, and they include the right to asylum, the right to freedom from torture, the right to free speech, and the right to an education. And they all sound wonderful, right? They sound great. But let's see what happens when we try it out. Let's take the right to an education. Okay. Now we've got 100 people sitting on our island. And I haven't explained really 100% the scenario. So let's just imagine they've landed on this island. They have 1 day's worth of food each. And they all speak the same language. They can communicate with each other, but they don't know each other. Right? So they don't have any prior friendships or associations. Right? So now imagine one of these persons says, hold on a second. My rights are being infringed. I have a right to an education. Upon who does this person hang their right? Upon who is it? Whose responsibility is it to meet that right? Now, I suppose an answer would be, oh, that's the community's responsibility. Everybody needs to do that. Well, then, how are we going to organise that? And what happens if, say, you're going to have to basically elect a leader? You're going to then have to maybe try using some democracy or other methods of making decisions as a group. And eventually, you're going to have to start taking taxes from people, and then so you can pay for this person's right to an education. Now, the word education could mean anything. If we're living on an island and there are fish in the sea and it's difficult to grow food, some people might say, oh, well, let's educate people to be able to fish. And let's also educate them to so that they are civil and nice to each other, right? And that they share, right? That's one thing that could happen. Now, if one of the people in this 100 decides that they don't want to share and that they want to do their own thing, what's going to happen? Well, other people will probably start to copy them, and things start to go downhill pretty quickly, right? So whoever has been elected leader may make some rules like, well, if you try to get out of what we have now said is your responsibilities, not your rights, but your responsibilities, we will use collective force against you. Okay, so that's the way I see things panning out. If you had to try and deliver these rights, right, without having any idea of responsibilities, and responsibilities have to be given by somebody, and they have to be enforced by somebody. So that's one way you can go. Okay, so now let's look at scenario B. Scenario A was enforcing human rights, and scenario B is if these 100 people try to organise themselves via some form of socialism. Now, I've put up the Wikipedia entry, or the dictionary entry, sorry, of socialism, but the reality is that there's so many different variants and different ways of interpreting it, so I'm just going to try and keep it pretty vague and rough, and this is intended to be my own personal take on it, not a definitive. So in socialism, the idea really is that nothing is owned by an individual, and everything is communal property, and all decisions are kind of made via the community as a whole. So, as I said prior, we can imagine that our people on this island are going to need to get some food, right? And let's say that it's quite hard to grow food, and they've only got 1 day's worth of supplies, so it's time to go fishing, right? That seems to be the sensible option. Now, when people go fishing, some people are good and some people are bad at fishing. Now, I go down to the shore, and I manage to get myself enough food for myself and some excess, right? Under socialism, that excess will be redistributed, right? And the people who are unfortunate and not very good at fishing and maybe can only get enough to keep themselves fed for half a day from a whole day's fishing, they would get the excess that somebody who was very good at fishing could produce. Now, on paper, this sounds fantastic, just like human rights sound fantastic. But ultimately, these systems, historically, certainly from the systems I've looked at, and let's be realistic, there has really never been a socialist country that has been a success, right? So what ends up happening is you get unfair distribution, really. Someone has to decide what is excess production. Someone has to decide who shares what. Imagine living in a society like this where what you produce and what you manage to get for yourself, you don't get to keep for yourself. In my image, I used images of the aliens from Toy Story because I was trying to ignore the fact that you get male and female and you get children and adults and all the rest of it. So just to keep things simple and to try and sort of analyze things in their simplest form. But ultimately, if there wasn't enough food to go around, right, how would you decide who gets to eat and who doesn't? I mean, do we all stay malnourished? That's going to lead to the death of the entire 100. The decisions, whoever makes those decisions is essentially going to decide who dies and lives, right? So I don't see any clear or fair way of deciding that, right? Just as prior, I mean, how would you decide, if you're going to say education is a right, how would you decide what to educate people about? So I think it's quite problematic, and I certainly don't like the idea of if I pulled out all the stops and I absolutely, went crazy at the fishing and managed to get enough food to feed my family, for instance, my own family, I would not be very happy about, say, a less hard-working person.
This is a Curzon Man Them C-Mac, yeah, featuring little fuck Kev, yeah. Over there in that corner, it's our boy Ginger Joe, yeah. We don't fuck about. Kick it, Kev. Got on the bus with me, day saver.
Getting to have a share of my food, right? Or even a very lazy person, somebody who isn't willing to contribute to society, taking a share of my food. Okay, so let's go with my pretty weak definition of liberalism. And like I say, it's not supposed to be definitive, right? But I do think that this is the general principle and the one I agree with, basically. So the liberal ideal is that it's the individual's freedom that's the most important thing. Each individual, each of these 100 people should be free to do as they wish, as they please, as long as they're not causing harm to other people. There's loads of complicated stuff that you may have to encounter and deal with and that muddy the waters and make it difficult to understand. For instance, somebody might start mining and wreck the landscape, and then that affects everybody else, and are they free to do this or not? But I'm going to ignore those kind of complications because, like I say, these are ideal situations, and it's my take on it, basically. So the general principle then would be no individual can be forced to do, say, or give anything to another person or organisation or entity without that person's consent. No transaction can take place without both parties mutually consenting to the transaction. So now let's run the scenario and see what happens. We land on this island. There's 100 people. They've got one day's worth of food. People are hungry. They're getting a bit nervous. Maybe I turn to the person next to me and say, you look like a healthy person. You look like you could do some decent fishing. Do you want to help me out? We'll go down to the coast and we'll see if we can get some fish. Whatever we catch, we can share between us. How about that? These types of tasks, if you was to go fishing, especially on a boat, it'd be difficult to do on your own. It's certainly easier to do it with someone else. If that person says, no, I don't consent to doing that, then I might go and ask someone else, or I might go on my own. If that person does consent to that, which, let's face it, is more likely because, two human beings cooperating are a lot more powerful than two individuals not cooperating, right? We go down to the coast, we do this. If I renege on my deal, if I try to mess around and steal a bit of an extra share for myself, right, then I have broken the contract. And by right, I should be punished or reprimanded by the community. If we all agree that we should be liberal and have a liberal society. That's what I would expect to happen. A bit of mob rule, you might think, but ultimately, if you agree on a contract with somebody else, and you knew what you were doing when you got into it, and you haven't lied and all the rest of it, then I think that's an acceptable way of behaving. Now, let's say that, you know, this island's not made of 100. It hasn't got 100 little aliens on it who are all identical. You've got old people and young people. You've got men and women. You've got children. You've got all kinds. So you're going to have some people who are really good at fishing and some people who aren't. So let's just say, you know, you get 3 or 4 people get together and they can get enough food for, say, 30 people, and they decide to keep it to themselves. Well, for a start, you know, maybe they could dry the fish out and keep it. So maybe they could do that if they took the time to do it. But it would probably make more sense to them to. I mean, fish on its own is pretty boring, right? And other people want that fish desperately. You know, they'll be starving hungry. Let's say that they're not capable of fishing. They might be capable of, though, of offering services. Hey, I will gut and dry your fish for you in exchange for a meal, right? That's something someone could do. And people could trade. If they choose to trade or not to trade, that's their choice. If they choose to work or not to work, that is their choice. But nobody has the right to walk up to people and say, give me what you've got. They can only go up to people and say, they could ask, could you give me what you've got? And if the person consents and says, yes, in this case, I think that some charity is a good idea. I'd like to keep you alive for a few more days because you might come in handy later. Maybe you'll be able to contribute to society at some point later, or contribute to me at some point later, or maybe I'm just doing it out of the goodness of my heart. That would be my choice, or the person who's being asked's choice. I don't think that. I think ultimately this is how human beings have organised themselves since the beginning of time, right? Small groups of people, you know, growing up, living off the land, hunting and gathering, bartering and exchanging. And out of that, I think all of the modern world's inventions has come, right? When you've got trade like this, it allows everyone to work to their strengths. If you're a big strap-in geezer and you've got, you know, the guns and you can throw a spear and you can catch food really well, you go and do that, and you go and hunt and catch enough food for 20 people. You can then go into the village and you can exchange that for something else. Maybe, you know, the mussels and that, they're great, and your throwing hand is fantastic and you can catch food well, but you're not very good at making the spears, right? It makes sense to have somebody else who's physically not as robust as yourself, but maybe much better with their hands, to sit around all day making spears so that other people can hunt very effectively. If it took me a whole day to make a spear, a good one, and this guy can make 10 spears in a day because that's his specialism, the whole community is wealthier as a result. It doesn't take any centralized planning because people are operating individually, right, and working things out for themselves. You know, if I decide to try and go hunt for crayfish and someone else decides to go and hunt for sea bass, right, maybe one of us will be very successful and the other one won't. So some experiments get tried out. When I see that my experiment's not working, I'm not able to get enough sea bass, it's really difficult to fish, but someone else is doing very well at getting the crayfish, I'll go and copy them. Nothing wrong with that. If it was all decided centrally by a committee, everything's slower, right? When you've got liberalism and everyone is free to do as they wish as long as they're not harming others, all those 100 minds are searching the landscape of ideas for ways to make their lives better, right? If you had a central committee deciding everything, you would never get hobbies like downhill mountain biking or BMXing or bodybuilding, or no one would say that these are sensible things to do, yet many of us enjoy these types of things. And I think in a liberal and free society where no one's forced, right, you get a much more variety of things, much more varied culture, and it's just a much more interesting and happy place to live. And that's the place I want to live. Right, so this is really a video about my political stance, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have any comments or criticisms, I'm happy to hear them. Please make them in the comments. Keep it polite. Thanks for watching.